So I'm going to talk about psychedelic psychotherapy today. I'm going to talk about the characteristics of the psychedelic experience, kind of a way to think about it phenomenologically to help in its description, and talk about how psychedelics can be utilized safely, really for therapeutic benefit and to avoid the classic bad trip, the kind of psychological adverse events. I'm going to specifically talk about psilocybin, since I have experience using that in a clinical trial at Harbor-UCLA, and there's been 2 other studies completed with psilocybin. And get into our study. So when it comes to characterizing the experience, I think it's important to remember that psychedelics do not produce a specific drug-induced state. And this was well described by Stan Grof, who did a lot of the early work with psychedelics in the 50s and 60s in Maryland. Rather, we must consider the sort of extra pharmacological influences, such as understanding the effects of the drug, purposeful ingestion, the preparation, and environmental and interpersonal elements. So these sort of ideas led to the development of this very important concept with psychedelics known as set and setting. These were originally described by Timothy Leary and his colleagues at Harvard when they were using LSD in some research. So set is really talking about what the individual who ingests a psychedelic brings to the table in terms of their life experience, their mood, expectations, family history, their personality structure, significant relationships, and their systems of belief. Setting really accounts for all the other factors that are kind of not internal to the person, the physical environment, location, all sorts of sensory stimuli that might be present during intoxication, and the other participants, particularly a therapist or a facilitator. Walter Pahnke is an important figure in psychedelic research. He was a Harvard-trained psychiatrist and minister who wrote a PhD thesis at Harvard Divinity School about the psychedelic experience. And through his research, he basically defined 5 distinct experiences. Now, these experiences really shouldn't be thought of as separate occurrences with each individual. Any experience can have aspects of all of these. But he kind of classically divided these into these 5 experiences. And again, this was not dose-related. He and others related. This was really most related to the set and the setting of the individual during the use of the substance. So the psychotic experience is kind of the classic bad trip. This is like an intense fear to the point of panic, paranoia, delusions, really loss of a sense of self, and often a lot of kind of physical discomfort. For a time in the 60s, there was a psychotomimetic paradigm where psychiatrists and other researchers thought that they could model schizophrenia with a substance-induced psychosis using LSD, psilocybin, DMT, PCP. However, this was abandoned because it really didn't fit that model. And not everybody becomes psychotic, and actually most people don't. But that kind of was an interesting bit of history. The psychodynamic experience is really about the emergence of unconscious material into the consciousness that can later be integrated through depth psychotherapy. So this was practiced by depth psychotherapists, mainly in Europe, a little bit in the United States, again in the 50s and the 60s. And the model of psycholytic therapy was low-dose psychedelics over multiple sessions, and this was integrated through depth psychotherapy. Another class is the cognitive psychedelic experience, which is really characterized by this amazing, astonishing lucid thought, where maybe a problem or some sort of project can be seen from a new perspective, or interrelationships can be re-examined. 2 kind of notable maybe examples of this. Well, first is Kerry Mullis, who developed PCR. He publicly acknowledged in his kind of interesting autobiography that he used LSD when kind of contemplating how to develop a technology for the research he was pursuing. And another person who spoke, but not publicly, about using LSD was Francis Crick, who, according to many sources, was using LSD when he was contemplating the structure of DNA. Now, I know somebody who's writing a book about the history of psychedelics who recently, or at one point, interviewed Watson, who will not admit to Crick saying that. So. The aesthetic experience is probably what most recreational users are going for. This is, when some of the well-known phenomena of the psychedelic intoxications, such as synesthesia, visions of beautiful colors, intricate geometric patterns, forms, architectural patterns. So this is really kind of, an aesthetic experience. And a term that's out there among kind of recreational psychedelic users is psychonaut, which really means Greek sailor of the mind. And I think this is kind of the experience that those folks are going for. Now, what I'm most interested in my research, and what many researchers have been interested in, again, recently, is what Hankey called the mystical experience, what might be called the peak psychedelic experience, the transcendental experience, the cosmic experience. And in his PhD thesis, he argued that this experience was identical to the kind of mystical experience described in all the major religions of the world. And he felt that there were 9 universal qualities of both a psychedelic mystical experience or one of the more ecstatic religious mystical experiences, that these were really identical. So these 9 universal qualities of the mystical or peak psychedelic experience are a sense of unity of oneness. There's a transcendence of time and space, deeply felt positive mood, a sense of sacredness. There's a noetic quality, meaning there's some sort of insight gained from this process. There's paradoxicality, where logical contradictions become apparent if descriptions are strictly analyzed. Ineffability, really an inability to really put to words what this experience means. Transiency, and a persisting positive change in attitudes or behavior. Now, those of you familiar with Abraham Maslow and his book Toward a Psychology of Being, these 9 universal qualities are very similar to the characteristics he described more common as occurring more commonly among self-actualized people when he would study, the great NFL player at the moment when, they scored their first touchdown, or a nursing mother during that kind of period of joy, connecting with their infant. So these kind of qualities have been described and studied in other areas of psychology. So just kind of looking at this, I was trying to find some sort of cross-cultural evidence, and I'll give you a lot more of that later. But it's interesting. There's one study recently in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs, which looked at psychedelic users versus non-psychedelic drug users versus social drinkers in 2 sites, Australia and Israel. Again, this is not indigenous use of plant medicine. And users of psychedelics scored higher on mystical beliefs, life values, and spirituality, and concern for others than the other groups. And also in 2006, this is an article in Psychopharmacology, Roland Griffiths and his team at Johns Hopkins University did a study with psychedelic naive individuals trying to see if they could induce a mystical experience in healthy volunteers. And it's a great paper to read, but 22 out of the 36 individuals, this is in the U.S., had a mystical experience in psilocybin. And in fact, 2/3 of those participants, again, who had never used psychedelic drugs, endorsed it as being among the top 5 most important experiences of their life. And I believe it was 1/3 said it was the most powerful transcendent experience they'd ever had in their life. The idea of this peak psychedelic experience brings us to the concept of psychedelic psychotherapy, which was known as the psychedelic method, practiced in the United States. A lot of research was done. About 40,000 patients were treated across the U.S. and Canada during that time. And the idea with this was that the peak psychedelic experience should be the focus, because they found that this had the most dramatic effect in terms of taking care of fear, anxiety, depression, and pain. And they also felt when people were able to integrate these experiences, either through spiritual work or other kinds of therapeutic work, this really can leave a long-lasting effect after just one kind of treatment with the psychedelic, if there was a mystical experience. So a lot of people have written about how do we, set and setting are the most important factors that influence the psychedelic experience. How do we manipulate those to best go for a therapeutic benefit? So Myron Stolaroff is a veteran psychedelic researcher who ran psychedelic research lab in Palo Alto in the 50s and 60s. And he writes that set is the most important. And the key characteristics of having kind of a mystical experience and a powerful psychedelic experience are really honesty, to be seeking knowledge, appreciate life in all its forms, and have some sort of ongoing spiritual discipline to help really integrate the experience. Now, in terms of the setting, he felt that the facilitator or the sitter is the most important aspect of the setting. And it's really important for the facilitator to be supportive, reassuring, and nourishing to the individual and maintain a safe and beautiful environment for the experience. Now, a concept of the facilitator is really the person who kind of leads somebody during a psychedelic experience. Now, this can be an individual or a team, so there must be a therapeutic alliance and a relationship with the person. And this person is someone who remains sober and really is there only to provide gentle redirection when needed. Because, as we'll get to in a minute, psychedelics are generally very well tolerated in appropriate settings. This is something about... it's important for the facilitator to become familiar with the substance because there are a variety of somatic side effects with some psychedelics, so it's really important to know what those are so the sitter can provide kind of gentle reassurance to an individual. And also to know if there's some sort of irregular side effect. Right, so when talking about psychedelic safety, psychedelics really are well tolerated in healthy folks who aren't taking prescription medications and who don't have any undiagnosed conditions. In a recent study in Lancet, Nutt and colleagues looked at the abuse potential of 20 different drugs weighed on a variety of characteristics. And the only two psychedelic drugs that they looked at, LSD and MDMA, which is kind of an atypical psychedelic, they ranked relatively low, 14th and 17th out of 20, versus alcohol and tobacco ranked high, 5th and 9th. Some of the psychostimulants and narcotics were among the most dangerous in that review. So the most common psychological adverse effects really are kind of mild psychosomatic discomfort, a little nausea, stomach tightening, maybe a little dizziness. There can be extreme anxiety, and it can go on to paranoia in a predisposed individual in a sub-ideal setting. There has been an association with acute psychotic episodes and psychedelics. Most people feel this is a triggering or an uncovering maybe of a first presentation of a major mental illness, such as a psychotic or manic episode. There certainly will be, one-time psychotic episodes as well. There also is a concept in the transpersonal literature about the spiritual emergency. I've read several case reports of folks who had a spiritual emergency after a psychedelic experience that they were later able to contextualize through spiritual work. Some of those folks required antipsychotics for a period, others didn't. But it really didn't lead to a lifelong, debilitating psychotic illness. And there really is no absolute method of predicting this, obviously, since we don't have that much research about this. In terms of reducing risk, I certainly feel anybody with certain medical contraindications and taking prescription drugs should really avoid taking a psychedelic. Probably if you have a personal history of a major mood disorder, thought disturbance, particularly bipolar schizophrenia, I think that should be avoided. There may even be a case for someone with a very strong family history of bipolar or psychotic disorder to be very, very cautious when using psychedelics. And certainly anyone receiving treatment, for an Axis I disorder really should think twice about using these kind of agents because they really are pretty powerful. Now, there's a couple exceptions to that. I just wanted to share with you some of the other studies that are out there. There was a pilot study with psilocybin for OCD completed at the University of Arizona, I believe in 2005, which showed really, really good results after one dose of psilocybin. Some interesting history behind that. The PI of that study, he's an OCD specialist, and he just heard several reports of his patients who would, go visit kind of mestizo healers and have mushroom sessions, and sometimes their OCD symptoms would remit for 3, 4, 5 months, and that's what gave him this idea to look into it, and they had some good results. There's currently an MDMA study for PTSD at University of South Carolina in Charleston. I believe they're treating their last 2 subjects right now, and then after 6 months that'll be published. They've actually treated 2 U.S. Army veterans as well with PTSD. There's our study with psilocybin for anxiety associated with terminal cancer. There's also the same group that did that study on mysticism at Johns Hopkins now has approval for treating 40 patients with psilocybin for any stage of cancer at a higher dose, but they haven't been able to recruit anybody yet. And I believe there is an MDMA study for anxiety related to cancer in approval at Harvard that is now being begun. Okay, just really briefly regarding bad trips. I get a lot of questions about that. So Stan Groff has a really good chapter about this in LSD psychotherapy. Basically, he feels that they're generally time-limited and they resolve on their own. He looks at the phenomena that it kind of comes up in these experiences latent in a person's psyche. So really, he feels it's important to allow the person to go through the process, remain grounded, and not to kind of curtail the experience abruptly, either by kind of talking intervention or a psychotropic, and that later that material can be integrated. Houston Smith is a pretty well-known religious scholar. He's written a book about psychedelics called Cleansing the Doors of Perception. He was involved in a study while he was a student at Harvard Divinity School, given psilocybin during the Good Friday experience. So he has a pretty lifelong perspective on psychedelics. And he has written that maybe some of the most dramatic and challenging experiences provide the most potential for growth when they're worked through in an appropriate manner.
Why avoid tranquilizer?
Well, the idea is there's a process that's going on involving unconscious material coming to consciousness, so don't abrupt that softly. I think he really recommends using physically restrain someone, hold them down when needed, allow them to work through it, and if absolutely needed, maybe a benzodiazepine. But the idea, you don't want to just curtail that right there. He feels that actually leads to kind of more psychological trauma, not letting that process kind of finish. Okay, so now we're going to talk about psilocybin. We'll do a little bit about the ethnobotany of psilocybin. So psilocybin is an alkaloid coming from what are really commonly known as magic mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms, from this genus psilocybe. And this is the most important kind of group of mushrooms used by Mexican healers. And they were also used in Guatemala. And this map kind of shows where they just occur across the world. When we talk about psychoactive plants, there's evidence going back about 7,000 years of humans using plant medicines kind of in healing and also for kind of religious use. This is a kind of a scratching of a cave in, I believe, in south of France. If you can see in this depiction, it's a shaman who's kind of dressed like a bee, and there's all these mushroom appendages. And they found that in some of these older societies, mushrooms when collected can't stay forever. They would actually store them in honey. So this is, and there were, honey pots found with remnants of psilocybin mushrooms in some of these kind of older societies. So they're really found in most parts of the world, really in kind of more disturbed areas. And I mean disturbed areas by humans. As humans domesticated cattle, this would disturb different areas. It would change the kind of flora and fauna. And as many people might know, a lot of mushrooms grow in cow dung, particularly psilocybin mushrooms. It's really their ideal place to grow. So ironically, as man has settled the world, mushrooms have kind of come with him. There's about 100 species that produce psilocybin, which produces a very kind of typical psychedelic effect. So this was not unnoticed by the Spaniards when they came to Central America. The Florentine Codex is kind of this interesting collection of writings by this kind of member of the Inquisition, I believe, just writing descriptions of what was going on in the New World. And what he noticed was, and when the effects of the mushrooms had left them, they consulted among themselves and told one another what they had seen in vision. So even in kind of the Inquisition's literature about this, it really shows kind of a sacramental or a ceremonial or kind of a psychological use of the mushroom. And in 1616, the Inquisition really got involved and really ordered the killing of all users of these plant medicines. Anyone using herbs and roots with which they lose and confound their senses and the illusions and fantastic representations they have, judge and proclaim afterwards as revelation or true notice of things to come. And here's another quote from an inquisitor talking about what these mushrooms did, which when drunk deprive of the senses because it is very powerful, and by this means they communicate with the devil, because he talks to them when they are deprived of judgment and the said drink, and deceives them with different hallucinations, and they attribute it to a god they say is inside the seed. So this really was noticed, by the Inquisition. Just a little bit of history to get you to now. During the 20th century, there was an argument in the anthropological literature whether these things were mushrooms or not. There were some folks until, mushrooms were rediscovered in the 50s, by the West, that really the Spaniards are incorrect, that they actually these areas in Guatemala and Mexico were actually using peyote, which was well understood and categorized. So for many years, really, in the West, we knew nothing about psychedelic mushrooms. then there was a famous investment banker named Gordon Wasson who married a Russian aristocrat. And for their honeymoon, they went back to Russia and spent some time out in the country. And one of the mornings there, his wife went out and picked some wild mushrooms and cooked them, for a breakfast. And first, Watson was very scared of the mushrooms because, being from the West, we're very mycophobic. But his wife insisted that they were safe and healthy, so he ate it and he really liked the mushrooms. Now, these weren't psychedelic mushrooms, just really nice-tasting kind of wild mushrooms. So after that, he became fascinated with mushrooms and became an amateur mycologist. And this is a man of, extreme resources. So he got wind of the use of mushrooms in a cult in North Mexico and managed to go down there and actually meet a woman named Maria Sabina, who's a famous mestizo curandero of the Mazatec tribe. And he actually was invited to a mushroom ceremony, and he brought Time Life photographers with him. And he documented all this in a pretty interesting kind of Time Life magazine article. I didn't keep the clip in here. But, and that's kind of how Timothy Leary first heard about mushrooms, was reading that Time Life magazine. I think it was from 1950 or 1951. And then it actually took some time. In the U.S., there wasn't a chemist who was able to extract anything that was psychoactive out of the mushroom. They tried all the best U.S. chemists. So then they sent it off to Europe to all the labs there, and it was Albert Hofmann, who is the discoverer of LSD, who was able to extract psilocybin from mushrooms. So and that's how we get it today. So for our study, psilocybin is made in a research lab in Massachusetts. It's not coming from a mushroom. It's a synthetic version. Okay, so this is a little bit about the chemistry of psilocybin. It's in the tryptamine family. If you take a look at it, it looks an awful lot like serotonin. It's 4-phosphoryloxy-N,N-dimethyltryptamine. It's active at 5H2A and 2C receptors. Medium dose, about 12 to 20 milligrams, produces a well-controlled altered state of consciousness. I think getting higher at 20, 30 really is a really profound dose. Generally, at this medium dose, this is kind of what we're using in our study. The effect lasts from about 4 to 6 hours. The state, there's stimulation of affect, enhanced ability for introspection, induction of primary psychological processes similar to a dream and hypnagogic state, and some perceptual changes. This is just a list of some psilocybin species and their relative percentages of psilocybin, psilocin, and baeocystin. So psilocin and baeocystin are two other psychoactive compounds that are available out of mushrooms. So talking about toxicity, mice can survive 200 milligrams per kilogram, which is a lot. And the ED50 to LD50 ratio, the ED is your effective dose, the LD is your lethal dose, is extremely high for psilocybin, 641, versus aspirin and nicotine. So now I'll tell you a little bit about the trial we're doing down at Harbor-UCLA. So we originally approved to treat 12 subjects with advanced cancer. Unfortunately, 2 of our subjects passed away before finishing the 6-month follow-up work, so we petitioned the FDA and they allowed us to recruit in 1 more. So we're going to treat 13 patients. We've treated 11 so far. We're doing the first session of our 12th patient this weekend, and I may be consenting a 13th patient tomorrow, hopefully. Our subjects for this trial can have any CNS involvement, no cardiac disease, and no history of major mental illness. And we're approved for adults up to age 70. The study is really looking at the effect on anxiety associated with an advanced cancer diagnosis, and we're also looking at pain. This is an experimental treatment. There is no FDA approval for psilocybin right now. It's a double-blind placebo-controlled methodology. Each subject serves as their own control, so they're admitted twice for the research protocol. One time they're given niacin, the other time they're given psilocybin. The psilocybin is kept in a safe in the basement of the hospital, and only the research pharmacist has access to that. So she produces a capsule on the morning of the session for each session. So in terms of, we do a lot of preparation with our subjects before the actual treatment. Make sure they meet the team. We really serve as the sitters or the facilitators. Myself, Charlie Grove was the PI, and our research coordinator now is Alicia Danforth, our bedside with the subject the entire experience. We want to help them think and contemplate their intention or motivation of entering the study. I didn't put this on an earlier slide, but there's a lot written about intention going into a psychedelic experience. It can kind of set the trajectory of the experience. It's a way to kind of work with set a little bit to help have an experience that might be more beneficial to an individual. And we really want them to learn as much as they can about psychedelic therapy. Now, a lot of people ask me, are these folks who have had psychedelics before, or are these all naive folks who come to our study? It's really been a mixture. We don't have a rule out for having past experiences with psychedelics, though we have treated some people who have had psychedelic experiences, some maybe once or twice in the 60s, some more recently, and some never. So the setting, there's a designated GCRC down at Harbor-UCLA. Luckily, it's a double-door room with extra sound insulation because this room was kind of retrofitted for a sleep study that was done in the past. So we tried to deinstitutionalize it a little bit. This is how Alicia kind of decorates the room and things like that, We encourage people to bring in personal objects and photographs, which they do, so really kind of customize it. Try to make it less hospital setting. This is the participant's point of view as shot by one of our participants. I think that's kind of a nice shot. So during the actual session, we encourage patients to really go deeply within and really enter the experience. We provide them with eye shades, and noise-canceling earphones. We have pre-selected music that they listen to. Now, we do have to check in once each hour to check a blood pressure and a pulse, and at 4 hours there's one pain measure that we have to do. But the idea is really to allow them to go deep into their own process.
You select the music or they?
We select the music. Well, it's not pre-selected standardized across all the boards, but we found certain music is helpful to kind of get into a relaxed, kind of state. Now, there have been folks, and one person in particular, who had some experience with psychedelics, so some strong ideas about what she wanted to listen to. So we just had those CDs and incorporated them some. I think there's some benefit not having music actually that they've never heard, particularly instrumental music, or if there are lyrics in another language, just to make it as abstract as possible. There's a lot written about music in psychedelics. I can see Susanna Bustos just walked in. She did a great thesis on the use of music with ayahuasca. So it's really an important area to look at. We're not in this study, but it's a hugely important influence on the setting. Yeah, some tribal, some instrumental, So, kind of world music, there can be lyrics if it's not in a language that's known to the participant. So generally, if it's not English, we'll use some of that. Yeah, because I think human voice can be very powerful, too, for compelling someone. One of the classics we use is the soundtrack from The Mission. Are you guys familiar with that movie? And it's really, it's a beautiful soundtrack. So. All right, so this is one of our participants who remarked, it was kind of remarkable how this weird music I would never normally listen to became a part of my trip. So she was very reluctant to, during her placebo session, sometimes it's fairly apparent when it's placebo, she started really complaining about the music, but we stuck with it. She's like, I don't like this, these are my preferences. But interestingly enough, when she had her, what we assume is the active session, she was just blown away by the music in terms of where it took her and things like that. So that's why I include that quote. So at the conclusion of the session, generally about after 4 or 5 hours, we do some integration. We ask folks to invite their family in and, get them together. And then this is kind of a list of some of the study measures. So, one is a profile of mood states, which is 1 day before, 6 days after, and then monthly for 6 months. There's a anxiety inventory, the Beck Depression Scale, symptom distress. This 5D ASC, that's the 5-dimensional altered states of consciousness. It's translated from German. It looks at kind of, at 6 hours, was the person's consciousness altered or not? And then the brief psychiatric rating scale, which is really to look at kind of any kind of psychosis or anything that would emerge from this. And there's some pain scales as well. Speaking of pain, most folks that we've kind of screened who have significant pain have opted not to go into the study because it requires going off, narcotic analgesics for the study, because that really would blunt the psychedelic experience. So that's going to be a measure that we're really not going to get that much information about. Because really, most of our folks don't have significant pain. Because also they're able to come in, into the hospital, spend a night at this stage of their life. So, so it's a little early for any data analysis, but hopefully that'll be coming soon. Every participant has described it as beneficial, just to us. And let's see, since I have some time, I'll throw you a couple of other quotes from some participants. I've always felt my mind was altered enough having OCD that I didn't need to stretch it out to see what else might come out. I had heard that psilocybin might relieve my OCD symptoms, so I decided to try it. So this is a very interesting participant because she was somebody who had contacted Francisco Moreno at University of Arizona about the OCD and psilocybin study. And she was disqualified from that study because she had end-stage cancer. So she was referred to us. And I did the screening with her, and she did not meet criteria for OCD, according to any structured interview. We do a skid for that. So we could bring her in. And OCD technically wasn't one of our absolute contraindications. So that was really kind of interesting. So she found it really, really beneficial. Also, she was a psychedelic, actually a pretty much drug-naive individual. So which was kind of interesting. Okay, I was comfortable, not afraid, and in touch with something that made me happy. I would very much like to repeat the study and compare experiences. Okay, so those are also comments by that subject. Now this is another subject. My first perception of the psilocybin's effects was a feeling of being supported by many hands. I thought about my relationships with my husband, members of my family, and my Buddhist teachers. During a bathroom break, I saw myself in the mirror and started to cry, grieving the effect of 2 rounds of chemotherapy, the loss of my long curly hair, and my relatively youthful appearance. I saw the cancer as part of my spiritual path. Prior to the psilocybin session, I had been plagued by obsessive thoughts that I would suffer horribly while going through the dying process. Death would not be the end of my life, just a transition. Throughout the session, I felt a strong sense of spiritual presence, of the connectedness of all things, and that everything is perfect just the way it is. Realistically, no type of treatment could completely eliminate the fears associated with having a terminal illness, but when I am able to tap into the memory of that blissful state, it is of great comfort to me. So that subject was someone who was, kind of raised with a Judeo-Christian background, but had adopted kind of Buddhism, mindfulness practices, meditation, probably for the last 25 years, and though I think felt she benefited a lot in her life from a lot of those concepts, it was really difficult to actually put that experience into effect when it came to this diagnosis of cancer. And in her kind of life story, she was really hoping to be able to make it through to the marriage of her son, which she has. And so those are kind of the personal issues she was grappling with. But she really felt a connection to kind of her own adopted spirituality, more of the kind of transcendental karmic spirituality through this process, which was a really kind of a gratifying thing for all of us to kind of work with her around. So I'd just like to acknowledge all the volunteers, our 11 subjects who've been so generous with their time with so little bit left to come to the study. So thanks for listening so intently, and we have some time for questions.